What do you call a man with 43% significant strike accuracy, 39% takedown accuracy, that averages almost damn near 0 submission attempts in each of his fights, has won over 70% of his fights by decision with not many performance bonuses, stands 5'11" in a weight class where the top 5 is mostly taller than him, and has just turned 36 years old, the age where welterweights should be declining? Is he a journeyman? A washed up legend of the sport starting his decline? If you ask me personally, without any context, he might just be the most boring, unsuccessful fighter in the UFC that somehow acquired enough Dana White privilege to stay in the promotion long enough to enter the twilight years of his career. By all visuals and metrics, this guy should have been cut for having one of the least fan-friendly fighting styles and some of the most questionable stats among fighters. But today, you call him the new UFC welterweight champion of the world. Belal Muhammad just came off the biggest win in his entire UFC career as he beat Leon Edwards by unanimous decision at UFC 304. But here's the thing. By all the fights and data that we've seen from Belal before, Belal shouldn't have done this well. Even in this fight, the stats would say he should have lost. This performance was an outlier. In fact, it might be the biggest outlier in his entire fighting career. This is a graph of Belal Muhammad's time spent under his opponent's control in each of his UFC fights. Belal, known for being one of the best wrestlers in the 170-pound division, doesn't really get controlled too often. Damian Maia found a good amount of success in his encounter with Belal, but even he couldn't secure back position and was mostly pushing Belal against the fence. And then there's his fight against Leon at UFC 304. 7 minutes and 11 seconds under control, and most of this actually done honestly, mostly through back positioning and a body triangle. At the highest level, this doesn't scream top wrestler material. Yeah, for a fighter who didn't spend a lot of time under anyone's control in his entire career, this is a pretty bad stat line to have. But maybe equally as impressive as how much time Leon spent controlling Belal throughout his 25 minutes with him inside the octagon was Belal's actual control time in the fight. Because even though Leon controlled Belal the most out of Belal's other opponents, Belal also controlled Leon more than any other one of his own opponents in the UFC as well. But let's zoom out a little bit. How did we even get here in the first place? To the point where we are now talking about a championship fight, a full 25 minutes that has a combined total of 19 minutes of control time divided between two fighters, because this was completely in Belal's plans. If we look at his takedown charts for his fight, we see that Belal landed a grand total of 9 takedowns, making it the most takedowns he's ever gotten against someone else. And he did this to Leon Edwards, someone who's fought Kamaru Usman 3 times and has defended most of Kamaru's takedowns. Heck, Belal landed the same amount of takedowns in his fight against Leon that Kamaru did on Leon in his last 2 fights with him. However, as impressive as Belal's wrestling was in this fight, Belal's striking looked just as good. Since the beginning of the fight, Belal didn't seem scared to strike with Leon. He was putting a lot of pressure with his simple 1-2 combinations and was forcing Leon to back up a lot against the cage before going in for his takedowns. In these situations, Belal typically has a distance strike accuracy of around 42%, which doesn't really spell elite striker material. But then there's his fight against Leon Edwards, where he landed his distance strikes at a rate of 55%. Furthermore, if you look at Leon's strike distribution for each of his fights, you can see just how effective Belal's striking really was. You'll notice that Leon Edwards' striking has mostly transitioned away from head strikes. The proportion of headshots landed has been actually trending downwards for each of his UFC fights in favor of a more body kick heavy approach. But in his fight against Belal, he resorted back to his boxing while trying to stop Belal's constant pressure, landing his head strikes over 2/3 of the time compared to his other targets. Belal's strike distribution per fight, on the other hand, remained unchanged, showing that he was the one that imposed his game plan on Leon. Belal's striking was honest, and he didn't show any fear to one of the most effective counter-strikers in the welterweight division. But as crazy impressive as Belal's stand-up was against Leon Edwards, the striking in this fight wasn't spent mostly standing, or even on the mat attempting to maul each other with ground and pound. It was spent on each other's backs, throwing a significant amount of insignificant strikes. Belal landed a grand total of 192 total strikes on Leon while he had him under control. The most total strikes landed in his entire career, and might actually be a welterweight record, pounding away at Leon's head without actually doing much damage. But just to put some perspective into how funny this stat line is, here's a chart of Belal's total strike distribution for all of his fights in the UFC, where the inner ring is Belal's total strikes attempted, the ring after that is the amount of total strikes that became significant strikes, and the outermost rings are the targets that were attempted and the proportion in which they landed. Overall, Belal's strikes are thrown with the intent of them being significant, whether he's on a guy's back or trying to pick them apart on the feet. But then there's his fight against Leon, where of Belal's 281 total strikes, 121 of them were thrown with intent, and only 68 of those intentional strikes landed. Yeah, even though Belal attempted almost 300 total strikes, only 23% of those landed with big damage, showing Belal really just wanted to shine those pillow fists in this fight. As the fight progressed, it was clear that Belal was dominating Leon Edwards in most of the fight, and although Leon almost stole it all again in the closing minute of round 5, Belal stood strong and is now the new UFC welterweight champion. However, it shouldn't have ended like this. Statistically, Belal defied all expectations. Despite having a career marked by an abysmal 43% significant strike accuracy, 39% takedown accuracy, and fighting against the man who beat Usman twice, he well outperformed his usual metrics. In the biggest fight of his life, Belal delivered the biggest outlier in his fighting career, flipping all the usual stats on its head, and secured that UFC gold. And as impressive as his performance at UFC 304 was, and now that he's an undisputed champion, I'll need to ask a question. Will you remember his name?